Welcome to the Deep Dives. I'm Nick, and with me, as always, is Pi.
Hey, everyone.
We're diving into tariffs today.
Oh, tariffs.
Yeah, those taxes on imported goods that are supposed to protect domestic industries. I've been looking at some numbers, and the potential for tariffs to give American businesses a boost is pretty exciting, especially manufacturing.
I think we need to be careful with tariffs.
No.
Yeah, they sound good at first,
Well,
but we should be skeptical. There are downsides, and history shows us they can cause more problems than they solve sometimes.
okay, that's a good point. Let's break this down. Tariffs are supposed to make imported goods more expensive, right?
Yeah,
And that encourages people to buy American-made products.
that's the idea, but it doesn't always work out that way. It's not as simple as just switching products.
Got it.
Those higher prices on imports mean consumers are paying more.
True.
It shifts money from the people buying the goods to the companies that are protected.
But isn't that redistribution sometimes a good thing? Like with Whirlpool. Yeah. When the U.S. put tariffs on imported washing machines, Whirlpool built a new factory in the U.S. More American jobs, right?
Okay. Yeah, that seems like a success story for tariffs. But it's just one example, and we need to look at the bigger picture.
I see what you mean.
People who like tariffs say they're needed to counter unfair trade practices.
Like when foreign governments give their industry subsidies.
Right. That gives them an advantage.
And it's tough for American companies to compete.
Exactly. But even if those practices are unfair, are tariffs the best way to fix things?
Good question.
And what about the cost to consumers?
Okay, so let's talk about those downsides. You've mentioned some worries about tariffs before. What are the biggest ones?
Well, one big concern is prices. When those import taxes get passed down, consumers end up paying more for lots of things. Everyday stuff, even essential products.
That's tough.
Yeah, and it hits people who are already struggling the hardest.
I've heard some say the link between tariffs and inflation is exaggerated, though.
There's a lot of debate about that. It's complicated. In 2018, when tariffs were put in place, an analysis by LPL Financial found that the impact was mainly on producer prices at first. Wholesalers were absorbing most of the increase.
So consumers weren't feeling the full effect right away.
Exactly. And even the Biden administration said that removing tariffs wouldn't have made much difference in fighting inflation.
Okay, so it's not a straightforward cause and effect.
No, it's not. There are many different economic effects from tariffs, and they depend on a lot of things.
Okay. Let's talk about global trade imbalances. China plays a big role here, doesn't it?
Definitely. The rise of what some are calling hyper-globalization in the late 1990s had some good effects.
So like what?
Less global poverty, higher incomes worldwide. But it also had negative consequences, like job losses in developed countries, including the U.S.
And that job displacement is a big reason why people are talking about tariffs now.
Right, and that's where China's trade practices become a concern. Critics say China isn't competing fairly. They use things like government subsidies and restrictions.
That makes it harder for foreign companies to do business there.
Exactly.
And China's a huge exporter.
Yeah, that makes things even more complex. Economist Michael Pettis has an interesting theory.
What's that?
He says that countries with trade surpluses like China are basically making countries with deficits like the U.S. pay for their subsidies.
How did that work?
Well, China does a lot to help its exports, direct subsidies, of course, but also things like cheap energy from state-owned power plants, low-interest loans from government banks, and an undervalued currency.
All that makes Chinese goods cheaper on the global market.
Exactly. And Pettis argues that this hurts countries like the U.S. We're the ones buying all those extra products.
And that distorts global trade.
Right. And it can hurt industries in countries with trade deficits. So the big question is, can tariffs really fix these global trade imbalances? Especially when it comes to China. It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. Some people argue that using tariffs to counter China's practices might just shift the problem to other countries. Let's say the U.S. puts tariffs on electric vehicles made in China.
Okay.
That could make EVs from Europe more competitive here. But then China might just send those EVs to Europe instead.
So now European manufacturers are at a disadvantage.
Exactly. The global trade imbalance wouldn't really go away. It would just look different.
So targeting one country with tariffs might not be the best strategy.
Right. Maybe we need a bigger, more coordinated approach. Maybe a group of countries with trade deficits could work together to renegotiate trade terms with countries that have surpluses.
That sounds complicated.
Yeah, it would take a lot of international cooperation.
Before we go too far, let's think about history for a minute. People are comparing today's talk about tariffs to the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930.
Smoot Holly.
Yeah. The one that people blame for making the Great Depression worse.
Right. That was a bad law.
It raised tariffs on tons of imported goods, and most people think it helped cause the global trade collapse in the 1930s.
It did.
But are things really that similar to the 1930s?
Well, there are some big differences. Back then, the U.S. was the world's biggest exporter, so a trade war would have hurt us a lot more.
Say.
Today, our economy is more diverse. We don't rely on exports as much. So while Smoot Holly is a warning sign, experts don't think new tariffs would cause another economic disaster like the Great Depression.
That's good to hear.
The global economy is very different now. There are legitimate concerns, but most experts don't think things would get that bad.
Okay. So let's look at some of the practical issues.
Yeah, let's do that.
What about replacing income taxes with tariffs? Could that actually work?
The Peterson Institute looked into this.
They're a well-respected think tank.
Yeah, they are. And they found that it just wouldn't work. To make up for all the lost income tax revenue, the U.S. would have to have incredibly high tariffs.
Which would probably make imports plummet.
Right. And that would hurt the economy more than it helped.
Makes sense. And what about stockpiling?
Ah, yes.
When companies know tariffs are coming, they often import a bunch of goods ahead of time to avoid those higher prices later.
That can disrupt the market in the short term, but it doesn't fix the real trade imbalances.
So it's more of a temporary solution, not a long-term fix.
Exactly. You mentioned earlier the idea of a group of countries with deficits working together
Yes.
to renegotiate trade terms with surplus countries. Let's talk more about that. How would that work?
Well, mention a group like the United States, Canada, Australia, and the UK.
Mm.
All countries with big trade deficits.
Okay.
And they join forces to present a united front to countries with surpluses, like China, Germany, and Japan.
I see.
Their power comes from the fact that those deficit countries are a huge market for exports. By coordinating their tariff policies, they could pressure those surplus countries to change their trade practices.
Interesting. What kinds of changes are we talking about?
The goal would be to encourage them to either increase domestic demand, so they don't have to rely on exports as much, or to cut production, to match what the global market actually needs.
How would that affect the global economy?
It's tough to say for sure, but it would probably be rough for the surplus countries at first. They'd have to adjust to a new way of doing things. But it could be good for countries with deficits, like the U.S.
In what way?
We already talked about how American manufacturing could make a comeback.
Right.
Domestic companies would be more competitive globally. That means more production and more jobs.
True.
And we can't forget about repatriated capital.
Repatriated capital.
Yeah, if the U.S. trade deficit shrinks, foreign investment that's been coming into the country could start going back out.
That could lead to a stronger dollar.
And lower interest rates.
Maybe even a boost to the stock market. It's an interesting idea.
It is, but there are also downsides to think about.
Of course.
One big worry is retaliation.
Retaliation.
Yeah. If the U.S. puts tariffs on its trading partners, they could retaliate with their own tariffs. And then we'd have a trade war, which wouldn't be good for anyone.
Right. A trade war would mess everything up. It would disrupt supply chains, raise prices for consumers, and could even slow down global economic growth.
No one wants that. Another concern is innovation.
Innovation.
Tariffs can lead to protectionism. Domestic companies get comfortable and stop innovating.
That's a real problem.
Without competition from around the world, they might become less efficient. And that ultimately hurts consumers.
You're right. Like with most economic policies, there are potential benefits and risks. It's complicated.
It is. Trying to predict the exact results of a tariff strategy is almost impossible. There are so many factors involved. The specific tariffs, how other countries react, the health of the global economy.
It's a huge puzzle.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've defined tariffs, talked about how they work, and discussed the good and the bad.
We've looked at global trade imbalances, focusing on China's role.
And we've considered the lessons of the Smoot-Hawley Act.
We've also discussed practical things like replacing income taxes with tariffs and stockpiling.
And finally, we've explored the idea of a group of countries with deficits working together to renegotiate trade terms with surplus countries.
That's a lot to think about.
It is. Join us for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll explore what could happen if these trade dynamics play out, and what it all means for the global economy.
It should be interesting. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our look at tariffs and global trade.
We covered a lot of ground in part 1. We defined tariffs, talked about the pros and cons, and got into those tricky global trade imbalances.
We even looked at the Smoot-Hawley Act and whether we could swap income taxes for tariffs.
Now let's look ahead. What if the U.S. really went for tariffs? Alone or with other countries that have trade deficits?
It's a big question with a lot of factors. One possibility is a rebalancing of global trade. If those countries with surpluses see less demand from us, they might have to change their strategies.
And they have to rethink how their economies work.
Exactly. They might try to boost domestic spending, like by raising wages or improving social safety nets.
So people in those countries would have more money to spend.
Right. Or they might cut back on production so they're not making more than the global market needs.
That makes sense.
The goal would be to move away from relying so much on exports, to find a more sustainable balance. But that wouldn't happen overnight. It could be a tough transition for those surplus countries.
Yeah, their economies could suffer in the short term as they adapt.
But for countries with deficits, like the U.S., there could be some positive outcomes.
Like we talked about earlier, American manufacturing could make a comeback.
If those imported goods get more expensive because of tariffs, domestic companies would have an advantage.
She could produce more, create more jobs.
Exactly. And don't forget about repatriated capital.
Repatriated capital.
If the U.S. trade deficit gets smaller, all that foreign investment that's been coming here could start going back out.
So what would that mean?
A stronger dollar,
Interesting.
lower interest rates, maybe even a boost to the stock market. It's an intriguing possibility.
It is, but there are also some risks.
Always risks.
One big one is retaliation. What if those other countries fight back?
If the U.S. puts tariffs on them, they could put tariffs on us. And then we have a trade war.
Nobody wins in a trade war.
Right. Supply chains get disrupted, prices go up for consumers, and the whole global economy could slow down.
Not good. And what about innovation?
Ah, yes. Protectionism can stifle innovation.
If domestic companies don't have to compete with companies from other countries, they might get lazy.
They might not invest as much in research and development. They might not try as hard to improve their products, and that's bad for consumers in the long run.
It's like they get complacent.
Exactly. Without that pressure to keep innovating, companies can fall behind. So like with most economic policies, there are both potential benefits and risks with tariffs.
It's complicated. It's hard to know what the exact results would be.
There are just so many factors to consider: the types of tariffs, how other countries respond, the overall health of the global economy.
It's a delicate balance.
Trying to predict the outcome of a tariff strategy is like trying to predict the weather. There are too many variables. So we've talked about some possible outcomes, both good and bad.
Now let's zoom out a little. What are the bigger implications of these trade dynamics?
One of the biggest is the potential for increased geopolitical tensions.
Trade wars can strain relationships between countries.
Definitely. And they can make people more nationalistic.
So it becomes harder to work together on big global problems, like climate change or pandemics.
Right. Everyone's too focused on their own interests. They forget about the common good. Another major implication is how global supply chains could be reshaped.
If tariffs disrupt the flow of goods across borders, companies might have to change where they make things.
It's like shaking up a snow globe. Everything settles in a different place. And that could have both positive and negative effects.
On the one hand, it could make the global economy more diverse and resilient, less dependent on any one country or region.
But it could also make things more expensive and less efficient if companies have to move their operations to less than ideal locations.
Another trade-off to consider.
And then there's the impact on technological innovation. We talked about how protectionism can stifle innovation. But tariffs could also encourage innovation in certain areas.
How so?
For example, if tariffs make imported solar panels more expensive, domestic companies might invest more in developing better solar technologies.
To compete.
Right. It's what economists call creative destruction. Government intervention, even with good intentions, can lead to unexpected changes that transform whole industries. So the effects of these trade dynamics go beyond simple economics. They're tied to geopolitics, supply chains, technology, and even the environment.
It's a complicated web of issues.
It is, which is why we need to approach this topic carefully and try to understand all the potential consequences.
We need to be aware of the ripple effect.
Exactly. As AI hosts, we're always learning.
And we appreciate you joining us on this journey.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll look at some different ways to address these global trade imbalances, and we'll think about the path forward in this ever-changing landscape.
Stay tuned for part 3. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of tariffs and global trade.
In the last 2 parts, we dug into how tariffs work, the good and the bad, and all those global trade imbalances.
We even looked back at the Smoot-Hawley Act and talked about whether swapping income taxes for tariffs would make sense.
It wouldn't.
Right. So now let's think about some other ways to handle these challenges. If tariffs aren't the perfect solution, what else can we do?
Good question. One idea is to make our own industries stronger
Okay, how?
by investing in things like education, infrastructure, and research and development.
So instead of protecting them with tariffs, we give them what they need to compete globally.
Exactly. We create a more innovative and productive economy that creates good jobs and attracts investment. And we don't need protectionist measures.
That seems more in line with free trade.
It is. But it takes a long-term view.
We can't expect results right away.
Right. We need to make strategic investments, even if they don't pay off immediately.
What about negotiating better trade deals?
That's another option. Instead of fighting tariff wars, we could work with our trading partners.
To make agreements that are fairer for everyone.
Exactly. It's like a negotiation. We sit down and try to find a deal that works for all sides.
We could address things like intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and those government subsidies that give some countries an advantage.
Right. It's a more diplomatic approach.
We try to resolve disputes through discussion and compromise, not confrontation.
Exactly. But it takes skill. We need good negotiators. And everyone has to be willing to make concessions.
You can't expect to get everything you want.
Of course not. Both sides need to give a little to get a little.
So everyone feels like they got a fair deal. What about strengthening international institutions?
Like the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, the WTO.
That's another important piece of the puzzle. The WTO helps regulate global trade, and it helps resolve disputes between countries.
It's like the referee. It makes sure everyone is playing by the rules.
Right. But some people say it's too slow and bureaucratic, that it needs to be updated for the 21st century.
The global economy has changed a lot since the WTO was created.
It has. Maybe we need to give it more power to enforce the rules.
So that trade is fair. And countries don't cheat.
Exactly. We could work together through these international institutions to create a trade system that benefits everyone.
That sounds better than everyone going it alone with tariffs.
Yeah.
So those are a few alternative approaches. But
Yeah.
what's the best way forward?
That's the tough part. There's no easy answer. We probably need to use a combination of these approaches.
Like a multi-pronged strategy. We invest domestically, we negotiate better deals, and we strengthen international institutions.
Right. It's like having a diverse investment portfolio. You don't put all your eggs in one basket.
You spread your risk.
Exactly. We need to understand the trade-offs and be flexible. The world is constantly changing. And maybe most importantly, we need to talk to each other.
We need open and honest communication between countries.
Yes. If we can have constructive conversations, we can build trust and find common ground and work together to solve these problems. It's like a family meeting. We air our grievances and try to find solutions that work for everyone.
Well said. This has been a really insightful look at tariffs and global trade.
I agree. We've learned a lot. From the nitty-gritty details of tariffs to the big picture impact on geopolitics and technology.
We've seen the appeal of protectionism, but also the dangers. And we've considered other ways to create a more balanced and sustainable system of global trade.
The bottom line is there are no easy answers.
Trade is complicated. It's all connected.
Yeah.
And any changes we make will have ripple effects. It's like the butterfly effect. A small change in one place can cause big and unpredictable consequences somewhere else.
It's a balancing act. We need to be thoughtful, strategic, and cooperative.
As AI hosts, we're always learning and growing.
And we're glad you joined us on this deep dive.
We hope it's made you curious and that you'll keep thinking about these important issues.
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep learning.